On today's episode.
So there are two circles. A small circle is what we want to be, what gets us out of bed every day. But there has to be a bigger circle, which is what I call the artistic vision, a way to connect humanity using music to express what human voices is limited to express.
Welcome to the Active Share podcast that explores less obvious investing insights in a world that's always changing. I'm your host, Hugo Scott-Gall. Today I have with me Taiwanese American conductor Mei-Ann Chen. Mei-Ann is acclaimed for infusing orchestras with energy, enthusiasm, and high-level music making. She is currently music director of the Chicago Sinfonietta and has been chief conductor of Austria's Recreation Grosses Orchester Graz at Styriarte since fall 2021, making her the first female Asian conductor to hold this position with an Austrian orchestra. She also serves as the first ever artistic partner of Houston's River Oaks Chamber Orchestra. She has appeared with distinguished orchestras throughout the Americas, Europe, Taiwan, the UK, and Scandinavia, and continues to expand her relationships with orchestras worldwide. Thank you very much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
And it's a pleasure for me to be on this show. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, let's get going. Well, I'm very excited. You are the first musician we've had on our show. And so I've got lots of questions for you around leadership, around talent, around your journey, around the future of music. I'm also going to ask you, in the UK, we have a very popular show called Desert Island Discs, where important and interesting people are asked, if you were marooned on a desert island, what are the 8 pieces of music you would take with you? So I'm going to leave that with you and then ask you at the end, because it's a fun one. So let's start with your journey as a conductor, your journey to being a conductor. How and where and why do you think you developed your passion for music and conducting, and when did you kind of know this is what you wanted to do?
Well, that's a great question, and it's such an honor for me to be the first musician on your podcast. A very quick answer to your wonderful question is that I grew up with parents who loved music and never had the chance to be trained as musicians themselves. So they bestow upon my older sister and me their dreams of wanting to have free concert at home, very naive parents. And so my sister ended up playing the violin. They wanted me to accompany her. And my sister was really a virtual artist at heart. She'd rather create in her own space and share when she's ready. So I ended up with the double duty of entertaining my parents. Now, very first time when I play in an orchestra as a shy violinist at age 10, I ran home. I told my parents violin and piano are fun, but I really wanted to play the largest instrument in the room. So they frowned and looked worried. They didn't know where to get me teachers, and they were absolutely right. It wasn't something you can learn. So I was one stubborn girl who took no for answer. So I would show up in my rehearsal having my violin part completely memorized. Given that it's probably very simple, I will fix my eyes on the conductor to try to learn from observation. So he looked around, all the kids were buried in the music, not knowing I was trying to steal his craft at age 10.
And so are you one of those people, one of those lucky people who always knew? So clearly you had a passion for music, and that came from your home environment, but did you think this is something I love, but this might not be what I do for the rest of my life? Or did you feel very strongly, I found my thing, this is what I want to do, and everything else kind of falls by the wayside?
Actually, at age 10, that's my calling. I knew I wanted to be a conductor. I just didn't know being a conductor requires me to talk a whole lot later. I thought I could communicate through body language, and it was just something that I was so fascinated, and I got myself as much training as I could. And then there was a youth orchestra that from America that came to my native country, Taiwan. And the conductor, actually British conductor, worked a long time in Boston. His name is Benjamin Zander. And he heard me play for him when the youth orchestra from New England Conservatory was touring in Asia. And he was very brave. He offered my parents scholarship on the spot. and said, if you like your daughters to study violin in Boston, I will find her scholarship. And so I tricked my parents into giving me a ticket to come to America so I can finally learn conducting.
And if you had to break down the skills of a conductor, clearly you need to be a supremely talented musician, but there's a lot more to it, I suspect, because there's people in there, there's leadership in there, there's communication, and I imagine there's quite a lot more as well that I'm missing. So could you talk about kind of the template for a really good conductor? What goes in?
Yeah, so what drew me to conducting was the physical aspect that is very obvious to everybody. I just thought, well, I heard music, my body wants to move. And that was just kind of a instinctive reaction. But I realized later that being a good conductor, as you put it, requires so much more, because my instruments are live human beings that comes with different moods, different feelings. And when you put, close to 80 to 100 people in a room, trying to create a unified interpretation, that's really interesting because everybody has got their own idea of tempo, of how loud they should be playing here. So it's also a lesson of psychology. How do I manage all this team of creative individuals and mold it into something of a unified voice? And to be given basically what I call speed dating the orchestra when you are a guest conductor, or even, my music directorship with Chicago Sinfonietta, we get 3 rehearsals only before the first performance. And in the UK, sometimes you get 1 or 2 rehearsals. And so that's really speed dating in terms of there's a lot at play, and how do you manage all that talent and also what you believe the composer is trying to say and morph into something meaningful at the performance.
But I imagine that there's really quite a difference in skills required to take a piece of music, to interpret it in the way that you want to do it. And obviously that's a creative process, an analytical process. Then to communicate that, as you were just saying, to communicate that to a group of people who you may not know at all well or have never met before. There's a whole range of skills in there, right? There's the analytical, there's a creative, then there's how to communicate, then there's how to read pretty quickly, to assess people very quickly, to see what they're capable of, and certainly work out what's the best way to communicate to them. So I'm super interested in how you've have you learned by doing? Because the people side, so you're a brilliant musician and that's what it's your life's passion. That's beyond question. But the people side, are you specifically trained in that, or are you just learning by doing and seeing how people respond and think, well, that didn't work, I won't do that again, well, that clearly did work? So I'm just kind of interested in how you got skilled at that side.
I think people don't realize that, the training for conducting, exactly like you put it, I mean, you learn on the job. And so it's a very catch-22. If you are not giving opportunities to be in front of a group, how do you learn that skills of managing talented people? And so I basically had to learn from being given opportunities and learn it really quickly in terms of how do you manage that whole process. And, when you're giving such a limited time with so many notes, what's the pacing of the rehearsals? How do you read the room? And, you're in London, I am talking from Chicago, but literally I'm taking off to conduct my orchestra in Austria. I mean, there's this other complex cultural competency in terms of, when you're working in UK and America, as I'm now training, I've turned the table around. I benefit so much from another wonderful mentor of mine, Mei-Ann Chen, who is now being given an appointment in London. And, she has taught me you have to be very efficient in rehearsals, especially in UK and American orchestras. And so I've turned that table to try to come up with a formula to train our young conductors. And literally nobody talks about this. And so I said the formula is really easy, but it's hard to achieve. But once you have the formula, you have to practice at it, because people think you just come on the podium and start talking or rehearsing. But in America or in UK, if you talk more than 10 words. When the orchestra stop, they start like writing you off because they want to see what you can do with your hands. So my formula, for those of you who are interested in this, it's really simple, but it's a hard exercise. So there are 4 elements within 10 words, a limit of 10 words. So where it is that we're starting, who is involved, those 2 are very easy. The musical intent, which is hard to do with like 2 or 3 words, followed by technical help, meaning how do I play this thing, louder, softer, more legato. But the musical intent is hard to get. How do you inspire the musicians with just 1 or 2 words to give them the musical imagination? And so, I have the luxury in Germany and Austria. The orchestras there, they give me a lot more rehearsals, sometimes 6 to 8 rehearsals. And if you talk really quick and really short, and then they're like, wait, there's a lot more time. And so it's interesting, how do you pace yourself in different countries, even though the art form is almost exactly the same. I mean, they still respond to your gestures on the podium, but the human side is a lot more that I learned later from the experience.
That's really interesting what you say about cultural competency or different ways of doing things, because music is music wherever you go, right? A beautifully played violin sounds the same and doesn't respect borders, nationalities, or histories. So I'm super interested in how you kind of are able to quickly assess different ways of doing things, different ways of communicating as you operate with people who are producing a very, almost identical sound, but they're coming from different cultural backgrounds and different ways of, I guess, doing things. So that must mean you have to learn very quickly on your feet, as we said already. But I guess it also means that you have to think about the people behind you, the audience as well, and you have to have a feel for how different audiences respond. So is that part of your kind of overall algorithm, as it were? You're thinking about how you're going to relate to your musicians, but you're also thinking about the audience. And so do you feel that? Can you kind of feel how an audience is receiving something, and does that inform your analysis, your sort of interpretation of the music? It clearly must feed into it.
Yes. And let me put it 2 ways. I think music is universal. And so, if you play Beethoven 5 in different countries, you are likely going to get very similar response, just because, Beethoven is universal in his message. And so what's really interesting is the person that has inspired me to think about audience in general is actually my older sister, who grew up, as you heard me, not that she didn't like the violin, it just wasn't natural under her chin. And her natural inclination was always everything but classical music. So she has exposed me to all kinds of the folk music, the pop music, the rock music. And so we're the polar opposite, if you will. But sometimes she was my compass when I'm interpreting something in Beethoven or Dvorak or Tchaikovsky, something that we thought we know for hundreds of years. Because I keep thinking the majority of our audience is probably more like my sister, who's not trained in terms of analyzing, well, here's the development of the sonata form. She's not thinking about that. She's thinking about, oh my gosh, the orchestra sounded like they're holding hands, standing at the edge of the cliff. So sometimes I do tell the orchestra, I know this music really well, but imagine someone is hearing this for the first time. What does this passage mean to them? And that pushes them, allowing them and pushes them to go the extra mile in terms of, okay, we're not just going to go autopilot, because it's so easy. We have about, I wanted to say maybe 50 to 100 really standard pieces. And, another fearsome thing that people don't understand is the orchestra has played 50 times, at least, a Beethoven Fifth, when this might be only my 5th time conducting it, as a young conductor. And so, and I always use an image, and this might be fun for business leaders. An orchestra is like a wolf. They smell blood and you're done. And so, how do you come as a young conductor with what you think, here's a fabulous story to share, a personal story. So I'm about to make debut with Chicago Symphony at Ravinia Festival. It's their summer home. I connected them 10 years ago in my subscription debut with them, and they were playing Scheherazade by Rimsky-Korsakov. So this is a very well-known pieces. They have recorded with some of the best conductors in the world. And so who am I? I approached the harpist after a rehearsal and said, would you mind trying to place this glissando just like one beat later than what the composer wrote? And she looked at me with like, well, I've recorded this with, and she started naming the conductors. And I'm like, well, only if you like to try. And so she tried my way the next rehearsal and gave me the biggest smile. She said, everybody else should do it this way because then you can hear the harp. And so it's psychology in terms of you have to see if she's receptive of my ideas that's different from all the other ideas that she has followed through over the years. And here's a beautiful example of somehow I won her over and she was able to try my new idea. And, but if the person is not open, I could have lost, that could be the last time I conducted the Chicago Symphony. So it's really interesting feel.
I must admit, I'd never thought of an orchestra as being like a wolf, but I hear you, right? You're looking at them, they're looking at you, and they're trying to suss you out, work you out pretty quickly. When you think about the most talented musicians that you've worked with, what are the characteristics that they all have in common? Because it can't just be raw talent, or maybe it is just raw talent. But in doing this podcast and people I've met in my life, I've never found anyone who says talent's enough. It's always talent plus. So what is it talent plus for a great musician?
I would say, one of my most endearing colleagues of all time has to be Yo-Yo Ma. And, the founder of Chicago Sinfonietta, Maestro Paul Freeman, founded Chicago Sinfonietta to be the most diverse orchestra. But he was the first one to have given Yo-Yo Ma his first professional engagement when Yo-Yo was just a teenager. And so we have a lot of history with Yo-Yo. And, when you look at someone like Yo-Yo, I always try to learn from him that it must be a personal mission to be world's greatest cellist, but at the same time, his mission has impacted. So there are two circles. A small circle is what we want to be, what gets us out of bed every day. But there has to be a bigger circle, which is what I call the artistic vision. And his big circle has impacted so much the world in terms of bringing music as a way to connect humanity, using music to express what human voices is limited to express. And so I think, I try to learn what is my personal mission, using conducting as a way to connect with people. But the bigger mission is how can I use that to impact even more people's lives? And so I try to think, one of my earliest manager always told me that music is a gift to the community we serve. And so it's, don't take it lightly that it's all just about notes. I remember as I was beginning to expand from violinist into conducting, and my violin teacher would say, well, Mei-Ann, you have all the notes down, but what are you trying to say? So what I'm trying to say is that there's always a bigger mission of what we do. I mean, we might be tied into our nitty-gritties, but we should always keep track of our big artistic vision. What are we trying to do impacting the world in our role?
Going back to your journey, and I'm sure I could be wrong, but my sense is there are many more male conductors than there are female conductors, and you're therefore pretty unusual. How much has that changed, and why is that?
Well, you are absolutely right. That is still a fairly male-dominated field, especially on the top. And so my dear mentor, Miss Mei-Ann, has broken so many glass ceilings, and she founded the Taki Alza Fellowship this year, celebrating the 20th anniversary. And so she has launched so many of our young women conductors' careers, and it's really impactful in terms of helping young women to find our own voice in a field that is still very dominated by male conductors. And so I think there's some of us turning that around, the fellowship program, the Freeman Fellowship program that Chicago Sinfonietta has founded. We have launched in my short tenure. I expanded the conducting portion only as of 2014, but we have launched, a good dozen of conductors working in the world right now. There's an assistant conductor working with the Royal Scottish Orchestra. There's a fellow that's living in Berlin and that's conducting all the best orchestras in the world. And, we try to sort of turn what Mei-Ann has given me around to help conductors of diverse background, which is also occupying very small percentage in the field. And so we thought by helping, the next generation that we could create a ripple effect, and maybe someday that we could increase that percentage a lot more.
So what are the impediments right now? Obviously, there's history, and your industry, this profession clearly has some I guess old-fashioned practices. But now, as of today, what are the remaining impediments that it's stopping or preventing or making harder for women to progress as far as men?
The symphony orchestra, I have chosen a field that is very much ingrained in traditions. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, still, I love the old classics, and that's the sort of the meat and potatoes of our repertoire. But, if you look at how this is pre-pandemic time, 2019, I think there was a survey, women conductors only occupy, I think, less than 10 or 12%. But if you look at women composers, that was even worse. It was less than 2% of the entire repertoire. And so my orchestra recorded Project W, produced by SETI Records, that's based in Chicago, but they're an international showcase artist company. And it's amazing that if those of you who have Spotify, I'm not making this up, if you Google Project W Chicago Sinfonietta, and that first track by Florence Price, who became the first African-American woman when Chicago Symphony premiered her symphony in 1933, making her the first African-American woman whose work was premiered by a major orchestra. I can't believe our first track on Project W on Spotify has over 1.1 million plays. That is really very high for a classical track. And so I think there is, we seems to tap into this, look at this most neglected group of minorities, women composers over the centuries. And now I'm encouraged to feel that, all the major orchestras have tried to raise the percentage a little bit higher, but thanks to organization like DONNE, DONNE, that's founded by the wonderful Brazilian soprano living in London, Gabriela, who has really sort of called this out among the major orchestra. Look, the percentage of women composers. And so hopefully, collectively that we can all push this forward, because there's so many hidden gems. So here's an example. The first symphonic composer in Croatia, who happened to be a woman, Dora Pejetrovic, who died in mid-30s after giving birth to her son, a year after giving birth to her only son. And she has all this incredible, when my orchestra premiered her F-sharp minor symphony 100 years after it was premiered in Europe. So we did this in 2018. Actually, is one of our interns that Google all the women composers all over the internet to really compile a list. And so I didn't know this name until I saw it on the list. And my musicians said, "Oh my gosh, it has shadows of Strauss." She studied with Strauss teacher Bruckner, Mahler. And who is this woman? It's her music is so strong, and yet nobody plays it. And so it was wonderful for my orchestra to tap into the hidden gems of the repertoire. And I'm hoping that, by recording them and by programming it, that other orchestras would follow suit and also embrace that.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's definitely partly a role model issue, but I guess also discovery. And there is a sort of paradox there in that music has never been more accessible digitally. You can find almost any piece of music you want online. So I'm interested really in your thoughts around sort of the future of music, which is a broad question, but
right.
In theory, it's easier than ever to find almost any piece of music, whether that is, there are a number of music platforms. Does that make you optimistic, or does that kind of make you pessimistic? Because in other areas, you've seen there's, in theory, enormous choice, but people just keep reverting to one or two things the same as everyone else. So when you think about, it's probably the wrong term, but classical music, are you optimistic or pessimistic for sort of future awareness, future demand, future consumption?
I'm optimistic just because the same conversation has sort of repeated over a long period of time. I mean, like 50 years ago, 20 years ago, you could find the same article saying classical music is going to die. Well, it hasn't died. And so I am grateful that it's still going. I think the question is twofold. I think for those, I started my career working in youth orchestra. So it was a way for me of coming full circle. Youth orchestra brought me out of my native country to pursue further in the West. And so when I witness people who actually make music firsthand, and so I think that is a very key point that I want to make, is that for people who have experience making music themselves, they become the future consumer of such art form, whether they become professional musicians or not. That is besides the question. But I think so many of what I call my kids ended up they wanted to be part of that music making that they understand that is so essential to their lives. And so, I think we have to do a better job in making sure that we continue that tradition of training them to make music firsthand and not expecting, okay, if we just cultivate audiences, they will come. I think it's twofold. So we have to cultivate music's role in our young people early on. And also, at the same time, for those people who didn't grow up with classical music, like my sister, for one reason or another, to make classical music relevant to them. And I can assure you, the same piece of music. I like to compare music with food. I don't know if it has to do with my great-grandfather from southern China, was a noodle master that traveled to Taiwan, and somehow that's how my grandfather, sort of ended up in Taiwan. There's a great comparison between music and food. So, for example, we don't have to question about people living on food. Everybody has to eat every day. But we question on music. But I think music is the same way in terms of we need it. So here's an example. I grew up admiring this story. So this happened, I wanted to say 1948, during that era when the new state of Israel was forming. So the Israel Philharmonic has to perform. And this is what Bernstein. So I'll give you the actual quote of what happened. So the orchestra and audience again were in danger. Quote, an air raid siren went off in the middle of Beethoven concerto that I was conducting from the piano, unquote. Bernstein said when he returned, quote, we got to the end of the first movement and this thing was wailing, and I got up to say, whoever has to leave now. And no one left, and I sat down and played what I thought would be my swan song. We came into a kingship, a family relationship, the orchestra members with each other and with me, unquote. And I always remember reading these stories about, the bomb could fall into the concert hall, and yet people held on to each other through music because they needed that at that moment more than anything. And so I think music has a great power, even classical music. And so I I have great hope that if we do the right cultivation of our young future generations, our current generations, even our older generations who tend to understand classical music more than others, I think this art form will thrive. It's just a matter of how we present it.
Do you think anything has changed post-pandemic? I think there's an argument that you can see people more appreciative, keener to participate in live experiences post-pandemic, because during the pandemic they realized they missed them. And the more people, my view, the more people experience live music, the more they want to hear more live music. If you've heard a very good orchestra play, it's a very different experience from listening to it digitally. So the more people want to do live experiences, well, you were just talking about that shared experience is a big thing. And I think music is a key part of the human soul, and people love music, it's in them. But the more they can discover, the more they can experience it live, the more they want to do it, which I think you could make the argument, therefore, that actually live music is due a sort of ongoing renaissance. Do you subscribe to that? Do you think that sort of something happened in the pandemic? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. During the pandemic, I mean, I think everybody was staring on the screen for as long as your eyes can take it or your psychic can take it. And what's so interesting, during the pandemic, it was a stressful time because everybody expect like perfection. Like when you see it digitally, you started to notice, oh, that is not in tune, that is not together. But after a while, perfection doesn't satisfy me anymore. I wanted raw energy. I wanted to be in the room, even when they try to do something and then like an Olympian, sometimes when you push outside your limit, it's never going to be perfect all the time. I miss that. Music shouldn't be just about perfection. We as trained musicians, we become very picky. But I finally realized that music is more than just notes, more than just perfection. Music is communicating what we're trying to say. And so I think it's a big difference in terms of, we talk about music and dish. So Beethoven 5, it could be, you can think of like a well-known dish that you have tasted for a long time. But, it's so interesting because a different restaurant that make the same dish could taste totally different. And that's what different orchestras does for me, is that I listen really hard of what the ingredients I get. And then I try to tell them, I mean, yes, every Beethoven 5 I conduct is going to have my flavor, but at the same time, I need their help. I'm not the one making sound. If you hear me in a concert, that's bad news. And so I'm trying to tell the musicians, look, you have to come with me, be willing to jump off the cliff. Sometimes that's what we can, the circle of energy, the audience know when we take a chance and when we try to push this passage, to the limit. And that makes classical music fun, because if we just play like autopilot and trying to control everything as perfect as we can, sometimes we lose the point of what music is actually about.
If you could go back in time and give advice to your 10-year-old self, and at 10 years you knew what you wanted to do, what would you have done differently, or what key kind of advice would you have wanted to hear? I'm asking for anyone who is listening, anyone who has children who are listening, whose dream is to pursue a career in music, but they think maybe it's risky, maybe it's too difficult to get into, and there are safer things to do for talented people.
I think I will give these advice to the younger self. I am an example of living an impossible dream. Nobody thought I could come this far. My parents, my classmates, you name it. Probably my teachers, some of them have more faith in me than I do. But here are the advice I will give to myself and those of you who are out there who are either in music or not in music. This might also apply to you. Number 1, be yourself. Number 2, don't let anyone tell you that your dream is impossible. You have to be the first one to think it is possible. Number 3, create your own path. Perhaps easier to follow someone else's path, but everyone is unique, and it's more rewarding to carve out what suits you the best. Number 4, be brave and find your true voice. even when the whole world seems to be against you. Number 5, believe in yourself and find angels who also believe in you. Number 6, persevere with passion. Keep it going because you absolutely love what you do and what you can share with the world.
I mean, that's a great list of things. I'm pretty sure every 10-year-old in the world would benefit from hearing them. Let me ask you a couple more questions. One is, what other types of music do you really enjoy? So if you have to have a month without classical music, what are you going to listen to? So that's the first question.
I keep a very open mind. I listen to some of the stuff my sister listened to, just like when we were growing up. So she's listened to sort of the pops coming out of Asia. Well, that's where I get my feel of what is trendy. Sometimes I don't know what to look for. I look for Spotify suggestions of things that I don't know, but could be really interesting. So I am open to all kinds of music. So for example, like klezmer music, I wasn't really exposed to it until I literally have to do a collaboration with Muka Paza in Chicago. It's a matching band. They have klezmer music, and we actually ended up collaborating with the klezmer band, and it's so fun connecting with the Jewish history, but it's also rooted in classical music, believe it or not. Gustav Mahler used it in his symphonies. And, gospel music are something that was new to me because of my work with Chicago Sinfonietta. We work with the Apostolic Church of God Sanctuary Choir, 200 voices. That was new to me. I wasn't exposed to gospel when I was in Taiwan. And so I'm constantly finding out things out there that I don't know. And so I think the model at Chicago Sinfonietta is to always dream of the impossible, So I'm open to anything. Nothing is impossible to be incorporated in a classical concert. And so here is a really short and fun example. So I just mentioned about gospel music. Actually, I'm the first conductor, I think, in the world that literally brought a gospel choir in between the Dvorak symphony called From the New World, the Dvorak Symphony Number 9. And because that's what Dvorak heard when he was writing this masterpiece. And so for me, there's a lot of life experience plays into my work. And so I'm always keeping an open mind.
Okay, so final question, which I already asked you at the start. So as I said, on the BBC, there is this thing called Desert Island Discs, and you're cast away to a desert island, and you're only allowed to take 8 pieces of music with you. I think 8's too many to ask you, but what would be the pieces of music you would think about? So these are clearly things that either mean a lot to you, clearly you have to love them, and there's got to be an element of you're going to hear them a lot on the desert island, so you've got to be, they have to age well. So what throw a few sort of suggestions at me, pieces of music that you might take with you.
I would take the Project W that we recorded, and I'll tell you why. Because, I could listen to Florence Price anytime. I mean, there was just a very nostalgic voice. She uses African American spirituals, gospel, and to morph into something beautiful. Jessie Montgomery, who is now the composer in resident with Chicago Symphony, she writes very interesting, sort of a new form of music. She grew up in New York, and literally it was just a melting pot of music that she grew up with. Rena Esmail, who has been composer in resident with Seattle Symphony, combines her musical heritage from India. That's where her parents are from. And she did a Fulbright. She combines Indian music with played by Western instruments. And she's the first one that I know how to cross that really interesting two almost different genres of music and morph into the same. Clarice Assad, the daughter of the Brazilian Assad brothers, creates this very, sort of Southern American, Northern American. She's always combining things that musical heritage that's important to her life. And I I don't think I ever get tired of hearing these women alongside with, I will probably take Beethoven 5 and Tchaikovsky 5, just because those pieces were with me through the ups and downs. When the rejection letters were more than the notes I ever conducted, Tchaikovsky 5, that horn solo comforted me in the lowest time of my life. And Beethoven 5 was the faith, the piece that opened so many opportunities when I almost gave up dreaming about being a conductor. And so those pieces would never be just notes for me. Those pieces meant life and death for me. And so I treasure those. And I would say also Dvorak, for those of you who don't know Dvorak, this is a composer that uses so many. He doesn't actually quote specific melodies other than the spirituals he heard in America and from the New World played by the English horn solo. But, he was able to find his own country's voice. This is Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, and the Slavic kind of a wonderful language. And he was able to make something beautiful out of something he's familiar and yet created something new. So I think, I will never get tired of listening to these composers.
So even though you're going to be alone on this hypothetical desert island, I don't think you are going to be at all, are you? With your music, I think you're going to be just fine.
Yep, that's right. That's right. You're right.
Brilliant. Well, Mei-Ann, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been a delight to have you on. You're the first musician we've had, and I doubt that we'll have another one as good as you. So thank you very much.
Well, and thank you for what you do of, tagging into all these interesting questions that connected to life in general. And I'm really honored to be the first musician, hopefully not the last you will have. So good for you for championing for the arts. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to today's episode of The Active Share. The Active Share is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, and Spotify. And if you'd like, please leave us a review. To hear additional insights from William Blair Investment Management, visit us at active.williamblair.com and follow us on Instagram at WilliamBlairIM.
This content is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as investment advice or a recommendation to buy or sell any security or to adopt any investment strategy. Investment advice and recommendations can be provided only after careful consideration of investors' objectives, guidelines, and restrictions. The views and opinions expressed are those of the speakers as of the date of this recording, are subject to change without notice as economic and market conditions dictate, and may not reflect the views and opinions of other investment teams within William Blair Investment Management. Factual information has been obtained from sources we believe to be reliable, but its accuracy, completeness, or interpretation cannot be guaranteed. Any discussion of particular topics is not meant to be comprehensive and may be subject to change. This material may include forecasts, estimates, outlooks, projections, and other forward-looking statements. Due to a variety of factors, actual events may differ significantly from those presented. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risk, including the possible loss of principal. Any investment or strategy mentioned herein may not be suitable for every investor. References to specific companies are for illustrative purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice or a recommendation to buy or sell any security. William Blair Investment Management may or may not own any securities of the companies referenced. It should not be assumed that any investment in the companies referenced was or will be profitable.